Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining. We're going to get started shortly. Welcome to the February 2024 edition of Green Infrastructure, Climate, and Cities. This is a monthly seminar series funded by NOAA that focuses on the unique challenges that climate change poses for cities and what we can do about it. My name is Franco Montalto, and I'm the director of the Sustainable Water Resource Lab here at Drexel University, which is part of the Consortium for Climate Risks in the Urban Northeast, the consortium that brings you this seminar series. If you're joining us for the first time, please go to the newly updated or soon to be updated CC Run website to be able to look at all of the seminars that we have recorded going back to 2014 when this series began. We offer continuing education credits for professional engineers, and members of the American Institute of Architects are also eligible for this particular three-part series. As we do the presentations today, as a reminder, please use the Q&A box to submit questions for the speakers. The chat is reserved just for us. If we can go to the next slide, please. This particular seminar is the second in a three-part series that CC Run is conducting in collaboration with the New York City Panel on Climate Change. Ahead of the release of NPCC's fourth assessment, we've been using the January, February, and March CC Run seminars to introduce each of the major chapters of this report, its key messages and implications for the city and the region. Today, our speakers will be discussing specifically the climate equity and New York City futures components of that report. In March, just as a preview, we'll be discussing health and energy implications of climate change in New York City. And the registration for that seminar is put in the chat right now. If you go to the next slide, please. So as I said, today, the focus is the climate equity chapter and the New York City future chapters. And if we go to the next slide, I'd like to welcome and to introduce our four speakers, Sheila Foster, Baptista, Deborah Balk, and Timon McPhearson. So what I'll do is introduce all four speakers now, read their bios, and then we'll go to the equity chapter. We will hear the presentation, entertain a few questions, then we'll go on to the New York City Futures presentation, entertain a few questions, and then open it up for open discussion at the end. So with that, let me introduce Sheila Foster, who's a professor of law and public policy at Georgetown University. Professor Foster writes in the areas of environmental law and justice, urban land use law and policy, and state and local government. She has been involved on many levels with urban policy and is currently chair of the advisory committee of the Global Parliament of Mayors. She's a member of the Aspen Institute's Urban Innovation Working Group, an advisory board member of the Marin Institute for Urban Management at NYU, and as mentioned previously, sits on the New York City Panel on Climate Change. Our second speaker for the equity portion of the presentation is Anna Baptista, an associate professor of professional practice in environmental policy and sustainability management in the graduate program at the Milano School of Policy Management and Environment. She's the co-director of the Tishman Environment and Design Center at the new school. And she's also a member of the fourth NPCC panel, where she co-chairs with Sheila the Equity Working Group. She was appointed to the Executive Advisory Council of the Megalopolitan Coastal Transformation Hub, or in other words, the MOC. She works directly with a variety of environmental justice organizations and coalitions to support environmental justice. Anna's work is on a range of issues: environmental justice policies, climate justice, renewable energy, land use, zoning, zero waste, cumulative impacts, and goods movement. So I will introduce the next two speakers as well, but you won't hear from them till the second part of the presentation. Deborah Balk is a professor of public affairs in the Marx School of Public and International Affairs at Baruch College and at the Graduate Center at the City University of New York, and the director of the CUNY Institute of Demographic Research. She's an expert on population-climate interactions. Using a spatial demographic lens, she studies a wide range of demographic and health outcomes, poverty and vulnerability. So she co-chairs the entire NPCC fourth assessment, and she's a member of the Society and Economy Working Group of the New York State Climate Impacts Assessment. She's a member of the U.S. Census Bureau's Scientific Advisory Board and a member of the National Academy of Sciences Committee on Population. Last but not least, we have Dr. Timon McPhearson, who's a professor of urban ecology at the New School and founder and director of the Urban Systems Lab. He was a lead author for the IPCC's AR6 report, contributing author to the IPBES report, and an inaugural member of the World Economic Forum Global Commission on Biodiversities. In 2020, he was named a New York City Climate Hero by the New York City Department of Transportation and Human Impacts Institute, and he also serves on the NPCC. Timon's research takes an interdisciplinary systems approach to climate change adaptation, environmental justice, and resilience, and he's published widely in journals such as Nature and Nature Climate Change. So thanks to all four of our speakers for joining us today. If we go to the next slide, we'll just quickly go. We'll do the climate equity presentation, as I mentioned, and a little discussion, and then we'll go to the New York City futures and transitions. So with that, I'll hand things off to our speakers, and I will, and Deborah Balk is going to give us a little bit of a history of NPCC. So you're up, Deborah.
So thanks, Franco. So for those of you who were here at the last presentation, you probably heard this, but this is just general background on the on the New York City Panel on Climate Change, NPCC. We're in the fourth assessment. There have been 3 prior, and then some additional work that was prior to that. The local law 42 institutionalized NPCC. And the specifications of that local law are to prepare for and mitigate the expected impact of climate change to help fulfill the goals of Plan YC, an initiative of the city, to amplify and protect, to amplify the efforts of the New York City Climate Protection Act, and to also provide state-of-the-art climate science and actionable climate risk information. It usually the NPCC is mandated to produce climate information for the city within a somewhat of an interval after the IPCC, the Global Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, produces its new assessment reports. So there's some linkage between what happens in the global world and our global city of New York City. And maybe just importantly, at the bottom it said New York NPCC members. The panel is we're all volunteers, so it's academic service for those of us who are in academia and those of us who come from other kinds of institution. It's volunteers. We're all volunteers. As I mentioned, there is this relationship between the state and the national assessment. Climate change impact assessments, they seek to characterize, diagnose, and project risks or impacts of environmental change. it's not new research per se in a lot of cases. It's an assessment of what research is out there. I mean, so the NPCC focuses on the 5 boroughs of New York City. The New York State Climate Impact Assessment, which just came out at the end of last week, and I put in the chat the link to that assessment. It covers the entire state. And then fairly recently, the National Climate Assessment also came out, and it covers the entire country by regions, and with New York City being in the Northeast region. And these other assessments subscribe to a sustained assessment practice, which refers to an ongoing process of monitoring and evaluating climate impact. So it's iterative. It may involve engagement activities, and you'll learn more about that sustained assessment activities in part in the work of the working groups of the Equity and the Futures and Transition Working Group, but all of the 4th assessment of NPCC took it upon itself to try to do sustained assessment activities with greater depth than prior assessments. We're learning as we go, and that this is state-of-the-art practice, and we're trying to do that within NPCC. So for those of you who don't know about the prior reports, they're all publicly available. The NPCCs 1, 2, and 3 were chaired by Cynthia Rosenzweig and Bill Selecki. Those are all available as part of the Annals of the New York Academy of Sciences, so you can Google them and find them. The current assessment, the 4th assessment, continues the long-term assessment work of the previous 3 reports, providing insight into the state of the science on climate change and its implications for adaptation and mitigation policy planning and action in New York City. It builds on this longitudinal data afforded by the ongoing research. The report centers equity as a shared focus across all working groups, and equity. There have been equity principles that have been deepened with each report, and we're going to hear next from Sheila and Anna, and Sheila has been involved in prior assessments as well, and will tell us a little bit about its evolution. But we've worked in this assessment, we've worked hard to try to make sure that all of the working groups had some focus on and considered equity issues as part of their work. So this was achieved. I think that's, oh yeah, okay, so fine, never mind. So the NPCC information will soon become available in a website that's going to be released with the assessment report in April. And you can find previous reports, links to them at MOCEJ, the Mayor's Office of Climate and Environmental Justice, at the link there. And there's a placeholder with a little bit of information about the panel and links to prior reports. I think that's it, and I pass it over to Sheila.
Sure, thanks a lot, Deborah. So for the climate equity focus of NPCC, I think just a little background first. Prior to NPCC 3, the last report, there wasn't an explicit chapter dedicated to equity, nor an explicit focus. So our task on NPCC 3 was to create that focus and to create a framework for climate equity. And we did that in a couple of ways. One is just conceptually, we looked at the literature and identified a 3-part equity framework, including distributive equity, procedural equity, and contextual or recognitional equity. Then we looked at the kinds of ways that we can understand distributive equity, and that was through the Social Vulnerability Index, and we talked about whether and how that could be adapted to track and understand social vulnerability in the city. For procedural and contextual equity, we partnered with 3 community-based groups in New York City. We Act Uprose in South Brooklyn, We Act in Harlem, and The Point in the South Bronx. And we asked them to co-produce an understanding of procedural and contextual equity, both of which focus on neighborhood level impacts and vulnerability, but also the ways in which certain frontline communities interact with the city and the ways that the city could be more responsive and partner with those groups. And so in NPCC 3, we had case studies of those three communities and how contextual equity, how an understanding of that helped us to understand climate vulnerability and adaptive strategies at the neighborhood level, but also looked at their experiences with the city through the procedural equity lens. So for NPCC 4, we're picking up on NPCC 3, and we're looking at a couple things. Next slide, please. The first thing that we're doing is that we are reviewing where the city is post NPCC 3. The NPCC 3 report was published in 2019. It's now 2024. And what we looked at, as this chart suggests, is all of the action that the city has taken around climate equity and environmental justice. And we make a few observations. So first of all, to collect this, we not only looked at these reports and various laws and initiatives that have come out of the city, but we also conducted interviews with city officials and former officials who worked on climate change and equity. We reviewed their executive orders, their available documents, and any other efforts that were focused on climate justice, equity, or environmental justice. What we concluded is that the climate equity work, I think, as depicted on this screen, certainly has become more explicitly focused on race and racial disparities. We note this in particular after the moment in 2019, 2020, when we had a renewed focus on race in this country. A lot of the actions that we see that the city accelerated happened on the heels of the George Floyd murder and the Black Lives Matter movement. And so the climate-related equity efforts of the city can be situated within a broader discussion of the city's increasing engagement with these issues. So over the past 5 years, as has shown, the city has made tremendous progress, not only in addressing equity and climate change impacts, making internal institutional reforms in the provision of city services on the distributive equity to make sure that they're tracking distribution along social equity and social vulnerability metrics. They've developed some great mapping platforms that are publicly accessible that track their progress in doing this. And there are ongoing efforts to better assess climate risk and sustainability and resilience planning, including at the neighborhood level, such as in their Edgemere Resilience Plan. We do note some shortcomings of what the city has done and the focus that we suggest that the city follow going forward. So there's a couple of concerns. One is that while there's a lot of data tracking, there needs to be an improvement on the community level, at the neighborhood level, for climate risk data in particular. And also that there's a lack of tracking of resilience investments. There's a lot of money there is a Sandy funding tracker and a New York City mitigation actions map, which exist as platforms, but we're asking that the city better understand where adaptation money and projects are being developed and how they're being developed, or whether in synergy with existing community-led planning efforts, of which there are quite a few around the city. And so we do recommend better data tracking and better granular neighborhood level tracking, and to do so along with community action. And we also reported back on the 3 community groups and the activities that they're doing since the 2019 report, and the ways that they've moved forward in their adaptation justice planning, really, and some of the actions that they're doing at the community level. And again, with the call for more partnership between those communities in the city. Next slide. So that's on a report back on how the city's doing, and some of the key messages for moving forward on climate justice, and moving really from equity, a concern with kind of distribution and procedural inclusion, with really looking more at justice. And this comes to the next part of our report, that we need to engage a little more. So one of the elements of climate equity was contextual equity. And so we're pushing that a little further in this report to focus more on historical and legacy patterns of injustice and the way that they're manifesting, not just in terms of climate vulnerability or social vulnerability, but also other kinds of injustice and vulnerability, including displacement. And I'll get to that in a second. But one of the things we do in this report is that we try to situate the vulnerability of groups in terms of their climate risk and why they're so vulnerable in the history of both New York City. So we have a section on indigenous history in New York City and the history of colonialism and slavery and the way that the region was formed, and the kinds of land injustice that occurred that have shaped our region and have arguably aggravated impacts to the most vulnerable groups. The figure on the right is really illustrates a deeper dive into the ways in which past policies and land use practices, like redlining, for instance, and affect climate risk and shape the vulnerability of certain communities. But not just redlining, but a number of adaptation policies such as buyouts and managed retreat, the way that hazardous and industrial land use siting in the area also elevates risks to those communities where, decisions about where affordable housing has been built in the past and where public housing complexes are, as well as various other factors that make it clear that the legacy effects of built-in racism and discrimination continue to affect our communities in the city, and that we really can't achieve climate justice unless there is a sustained understanding and attention to those elements, but also adaptation policy that takes those into account. So that's what this chart represents. Next slide. The other thing that we do is to encourage the city to take seriously climate displacement. What we do in the chapter is that we review what is now a burgeoning literature on climate displacement and gentrification that defines a number of pathways to displacement, not only from direct climate impacts, but also from migration away from the coast into higher level areas that then are gentrified, from various kinds of energy and other burdens, and from infrastructure investments such as, green infrastructure or adaptation spending that because of baked in and historical land use and other kinds of bias and discrimination have left many BIPOC communities very vulnerable to being displaced. And so we review the metrics to measure displacement and encourage the city to not just, again, evaluate and track adaptation investments to figure out whether they're having a displacing effect, but to consider adopting a new index or a new way of measuring the risk of displacement and the ways that it intersects with climate risk and social vulnerability. And so we recommend what's called a climate displacement social vulnerability score, which was developed with researchers at Columbia and our community. And that's been published elsewhere, and someone can drop a link to that article in the chat. But what that score does is that it measures using publicly available databases, including the SOVI, New York City's own displacement database, which they are statutorily required to develop, and then FEMA National Risk Index. It looks at the neighborhood level, the most vulnerable neighborhoods that are vulnerable or at risk from that compound risk from 5 different kinds of climate risks, from social vulnerability, and from the displacement risk that the city is already collecting data on, but does not include climate. And then that score, that index finds, of course, and not surprisingly, that a number of areas in New York are very vulnerable at that intersection of climate, displacement, and social vulnerability, including the Bronx, including southern Brooklyn, and other areas of New York that map onto a lot of vulnerability along those indices. So I'm going to stop there and pass it over. So one of the takeaways is that not only to understand and track the displacement risks and the combined risks of displacement, social vulnerability, and climate, but also to develop anti-displacement strategies in the city as an adaptation measure. So over to you, Anna.
Thanks, Sheila. Yeah, I think we'll go to the next slide. And I'll just continue with one more key message here that's a result of the chapter, which may seem obvious to some, but bears repeating as an important finding that continues to be quite relevant in the case of climate equity and climate justice, which is that we must address social and environmental stressors and pay careful attention to community-driven approaches, both in the identification of climate risk and evaluation of that climate risk that is compounding. Sheila described in the previous slides. That sort of community-centered climate risk evaluation in the literature proves to contribute to a more robust and reliable and actionable set of risk evaluations overall. In addition to that, prioritizing community-driven adaptation planning and having those communities that are most vulnerable, that are at the front lines of climate risk, be part and parcel of leading the decision-making around adaptation is also quite evident in the literature, and it's certainly quite evident in the CBOs that are in New York City, that we were able to draw on not just peer-reviewed literature for this finding, but also interviews with leading climate resiliency, climate justice organizations throughout New York City, including some of the groups that we worked with in MPCC 3. And speaking with them and in looking at the literature, it was clear that whenever you have community-driven decision-making and adaptation, you have much more intentional and actionable planning that the community has buy-in to. And of course, in talking to many of the community-based groups, but also in looking at the peer-reviewed literature and the online reports that are being produced by community-based organizations working actively in implementing adaptation strategies on the ground, it's clear that the approaches to climate adaptation and resiliency are multi-pronged and are focused on multiple intersecting strategies to deal with multiple intersecting risks and vulnerabilities that they're facing. So groups are not only looking at climate adaptation as a means for risk aversion, but also to increase economic opportunities, to deal with energy poverty issues, to deal with legacy pollution issues and housing access issues. So we see groups doing, solar training for job training, getting solar access in NYCHA buildings, doing a combination of work in housing for retrofitting, not only for weatherization and climate readiness, but also to relieve energy burdens, and also to help anchor communities so that they are not at risk of displacement because of rising housing costs and energy burden costs. So there are all sorts of multi-pronged strategies and benefits that come from these communities taking this approach. So I'll go to the next slide and move from key messages to trying to identify knowledge gaps and potential future areas for research that can continue past NPCC 4. I think Sheila talked about some of the tracking of the city's own climate-related equity work and the importance of that. And it's important that the effort to include and intentionally track equity metrics in particular will continue to be important. And it'll be important also for continuous improvement on these metrics. So we really want to recommend that the city continues to invest in not only their climate equity work, but in the evaluation of those equity metrics as they continue to deepen that work that they do across many of their departments. There's always a need for more granular, neighborhood level assessments. If anyone that's working in the climate change adaptation and impact space knows that, we need more granular data, better neighborhood level and understanding of the dynamics, the very complex dynamics that are at play in terms of not only the impacts, but the adaptation needs, because sometimes we understand that bringing in an adaptation intervention can sometimes exacerbate or lead to unintended consequences in other areas like housing or energy burden that were not considered previously because maybe we didn't have as good of a sense of what is actually happening on the ground and the complexity of those conditions on the ground. So the more granular data we can get, the better, I think. And then of course, tracking the performance of adaptation projects and investments, I think, is one of the key lessons here as more and more adaptation investments begin to be rolled out and we start to see, we're 10, 15, 20 years out from Sandy, for example, Sandy funding tracker and other investments that will come out of the IRA, the federal investments. It'll be important to be tracking where those investments land for distributive equity, but also the procedural and contextual equity metrics come into play here. What are the multiple dimensions of impact that those investments have, and how do we improve the impacts across multiple dimensions of vulnerability? So we're going to keep going on the next slide. Of course, I think the chapter really speaks to the importance of paying a careful attention to the issue of climate gentrification. And that means investing in sort of longitudinal and evaluative work that needs to happen to better characterize these very complex processes that are difficult to disentangle. So it will require some further research and, of course, the need for exploration of additional hazards and other social vulnerability data, things like machine learning tools and other emerging technologies that can capture some of those complexities and the linkages that are at the interplay of climate and displacement and social vulnerability indicators. Not easy stuff to pull apart and to understand. So it'll be important to continue to look at future research and the emerging approaches to understanding those hazards. And then we want to continue to consider how at-risk communities and the city can access, if we come up with great indices and scores, but how those scores and tools actually get applied and help communities and the city prepare for and really respond to the impacts of these processes. So, we're hoping that the introduction of a CDSV score and the development and evolution of those tools can be put into real practice for mitigating climate equity impacts. So yeah, I think the next slide, I think that's it. So I think we're at the point of taking questions now.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you, Sheila. So I'd like to just recommend folks to add some questions to the chat. I have a couple of questions just to get started. One just for you, Anna. You mentioned one of the recommendations or the needs is for community-driven adaptation planning. And I know you circled back to those 3 community-based organizations that you worked with during NPCC 3. And I'm just wondering, what are some specifics? Like what are the types of things that communities or community-based organizations need to have a stronger decision-making role, or to actually have their priorities driving the adaptation? Did you get any like specific requests?
Yeah, certainly. We talked to the CBOs, not only the ones from NPCC3, but some additional ones. And many of the groups talked about partnership early on in planning out adaptation investments. So I think the community's strong, and the opportunity for federal funding from the IRA and other, IIJ, other places where there's a lot of potential infrastructure funding that can come to the city. Finding partnerships early on how to plan for that funding and where that funding can best be leveraged in communities, so that they're part of that decision making, and they also are able to get multiple benefits. As I talked about, I think many of the groups are thinking very creatively about green adaptive economies. This is their framing that we heard from interviews, which is they don't just want greening, but they want to think about how investments are really grounded in community needs, and both workforce needs, and the development of a new, sort of new and green industrial sectors that can support the anchoring of communities, so that they are not at risk for further gentrification and displacement in their own communities. So we heard a lot of creativity around that. So it was everything from doing community microgrids, doing training around indoor energy efficiency and weatherization retrofitting, yeah, and then with COVID, what was interesting also is that we heard a lot from communities about COVID recovery, lessons from the COVID recovery process, and how much resiliency, social resiliency, and multi-pronged vulnerabilities and multi-pronged approaches were really critical in the response to COVID in their communities, and what they learned from that around the condition of the homes that people were living in, their access to social networks, and multiple types of resources. So there was a lot of interest in continuing some of the COVID resiliency recovery organizing, and to carry that forward into the climate adaptation planning as well.
It's really helpful. Just piggybacking on what some of the discussion you were just having, Lisa's asking specifically about displacement. Are there best practices for how you can green a city or how you can adapt a city and avoid displacement that you uncovered, or is it sort of large scale structural change? I mean, are there specifics that you can cite?
Yeah, we did look at in the last part of the report, we tried to briefly summarize some of the things that we learned in doing kind of scan really nationally of groups that have successfully created interventions. And these are frontline groups to avoid displacement. So one, for instance, right here in New York, it's an example that the city touts, which is Resilient Edgemere. It's an adaptation plan that the community worked on with the city. And one of the anti-displacement tools that they use is that they're implementing a community land trust as part of their plan. And another group in Buffalo is landmarking some vacant properties to stabilize their neighborhood against gentrification. And then Uprose here in New York mention zoning policy, maintaining the industrial zoning of their neighborhood instead of moving it to, say, residential industrial, so that they can have an opportunity to build a healthy adaptation economy with renewables, et cetera, and a workforce development component, but not have this kind of pull factor from rezoning, in which new residents come into newly developed, condos and displace people. So those are just some of the examples that we heard. Anna, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
Yeah, I think there's a whole lit review that's also included in that talks about some of the best practices from the peer-reviewed literature too, like from Philadelphia, Miami, other places but I think there's like a consistent thread, which is there's a lot of intersecting strategies with housing. You know, what is the housing, the infrastructure around housing organizing, affordable housing access and planning and organizing around affordable and accessible housing and economic development that speaks to the economic vulnerabilities of communities. So there's certainly a lot in the literature around, you know, what kind of community infrastructure is needed to combat that.
One of the things that all the anti-gentrification or the climate gentrification literature kind of gloms onto is land markets, right? And that links to our historical section, is that a lot of these interventions are designed to not allow the value of land in these communities that have been long lived in by a number of these communities to be extracted out. And so a lot of the zoning, economic development, you know, land trusts, land banks are designed to intervene in a market that really is not, has been unjust historically, right? From, you know, whether you think about indigenous land loss, Black land loss, you know, redlining, et cetera. So, so that's a direct response, we think, to the contextual inequity components.
Shifting gears a little bit, Sheila, you talked early on about how since NPCC 3, you've been sort of tracking with the city, you know, how the city has dealt with equity, and you said there's been a lot of good things that have come out. I guess a question from Lewis is, did you specify, are there specific sort of agencies or departments where equity has been sort of easier to integrate into process, policy, et cetera, and others where you'd like to see, you know, greater attention given to equity? Or has this been, you know, is it sort of mayoral priorities that then get distributed and you see across all agencies?
I think it's more of the latter. A lot of this comes through, and we're responding to requests from the mayor's office, in the mayor's office of now climate justice. However, I think that what they've done is to work with other agencies in the city, whether it's housing or health, et cetera. So for instance, in the last report, we found that a number of agencies were already using the social vulnerability index, but they were doing so in very different ways. So we try to give feedback on which factors in the index the city should track instead of just using the index wholesale. It has a number of factors that don't really apply to New York, like access to a car, for instance. So we pulled out some particular ones that the city can track and that all agencies. Now, how the city has worked with those agencies and whether those agencies adopt them is out of our hands. So we looked at more what the city was doing as a whole city government and not particular agencies as much. Again, we try to do a lot of interviews, not just in the mayor's office, but throughout the city, but it's very hard to be comprehensive with the resources of the NPCC.
Right. I think we'll take maybe one more comment now, just to move on to the other presentation and save some. But there's a anonymous attendee who's asking whether NPCC 4 weighs in on existing affluent communities that are requesting, you know, public funding, public resources for protection. Does NPCC 4 kind of weigh in on that, or how is that treated in an equity context?
I mean, I wonder if Anna has anything on this, but I will say that part of our literature review and the studies that are coming out suggests that, to the extent that we weigh on it, that many affluent communities do receive armoring funding. They already have resources and tend to receive most of the resources, including offering of buyouts in a way that continue to, you know, aggravate and deepen historical injustices. So we don't speak to it directly, but the literature does, right? And the literature suggests that this is part of the climate justice framework. is recognizing that these things are distributed quite unequally and they leave these communities even more vulnerable. Anna?
Yeah, I mean, I think the whole chapter kind of speaks to this question indirectly and in some cases quite directly, because the whole attention to climate gentrification and climate displacement as an area of the equity chapter was an effort to try to shine a light, a really critical light on what is this interplay between real estate markets, housing pressures and development pressures on the city's most climate vulnerable communities at a time when we see like a lot of affluent communities being built up on waterfronts and able to protect themselves, right? So there's definitely a tale of two cities in some cases, and New York is not unique in that regard. And so we were trying to, shine a light on these complex processes, and rather than treating them as sort of like there's a climate vulnerability here, and then there's all this other housing stuff happening there, that these things are all happening together in a city like New York City that needs to be carefully paid attention to. And I think when one of our efforts to try to early on, I think in the chapter, we thought, oh, we're going to track down adaptation spending and look at what the literature says about the distribution of adaptation investments and their distributional impacts, but there's not very much written about that. And unfortunately, part of the reason is there's not really good tracking of adaptation investments and how they get spent and what their impacts are over time. And that's, I think, a finding in and of itself, is that if we want to get a better understanding of climate equity, we must understand how the adaptation investments are landing and try to prevent some of the worst effects of that, that deepen the historic inequalities and injustices that Sheila mentioned is also included in our chapter.
Thanks to both of you. I think we'll move on to the next presentation. If you, Anna and Sheila, see any of the remaining questions that were posed that we didn't get to, that you can answer in the meantime by typing, that would be great. Otherwise, we'll come back to those questions at the end. But thanks to both of you. And let's move on to the New York City Futures presentation. I believe, Deborah, are you kicking this off?
Yeah, thanks,
Great.
Franco. Yep.
You're up.
Great. So the Futures and Transitions chapter or working group is new to NPCC 4. And, some of you may be wondering, what is this chapter all about? And why is there such a chapter in the assessment? Well, yeah, it is the first of its kind, and it's intended to generate a dialogue around positive future visions and scenarios and their intersections with current challenges. Part of the work of the chapter reviews the current tools and methods for futuring exercises, as well as their limitations and prospects for use in New York City. Another motivation for it is that it allows us to consider aspects of New York City's built social and natural infrastructure that were not fully considered in NPCC 3, though some of those aspects have been, especially other aspects of the built infrastructure, have been, there's been attention paid to them in prior assessments. Another motivator was that this working group aimed to inform new models for equitable climate change policy, planning, and engagement across the city's diverse social and infrastructural fabric. And that the existing models are, we'll talk a little bit more about that, but existing models are more siloed. And so calling out the sectoral or siloing of particular models makes it really clear that for equitable and engagement that one needs perhaps to broaden the toolkit. And finally, we synthesize the state of knowledge on sociodemographic, economic, transportation, housing, health futures, and many other subsystems of the complex system of New York City. So, and by this, I mean futures. So how do we think about the population, like a population projection or population scenario or narrative for 2100 or 2050? And how do we think about the economic prospects in the future? So not just what we know about New York City now, but how do we know about those sectors and aspects of those characteristics in the future? Next slide, please. So, and we're focusing in our presentation here on some of our key messages, and the chapter's got much more to it, but one of our key messages is that creating a more adapted and resilient New York City will require understanding the diversity of New York now and in the future. And so the graphic I have both on this slide and the next one really make this point. So let's just start with remembering that the climate of New York City will be hotter, wetter, and more flood prone, with multiple types of tropical and winter storms that are likely to increase in frequency, intensity, and severity. And let's remember that these events occur in place. And sometimes what makes a place hotter is not necessarily the climate, but might also be the built environment. Or same could be said for flooding, as we heard last week from the flood working group. The population of New York City is expected to age. New York, because it's a city, like so many other cities, tends to have a younger population, partly because it gets immigrants, as you know, it's a destination for many for migrants, both international and domestic, and that those migration streams tend to be of younger of individuals who are younger than average. So, but we know that as the future of New York City will become older, and I'm going to describe those pictures you see there in a minute. But we also know that in and out migration will continue, and those in and out migration streams will be coming from they will come from international origins, as well as within the United States. And New York City alone exchanges people between its 5 boroughs, which has implications for who's impacted by climate change. And finally, we know that land use and land cover will change, and those changes occur partly because of decisions that are made today, as well as decisions that we're preparing to make in the future. And the tools for thinking about those are, need to be put in the context of the larger framework. So just to describe what we're seeing in those 3 orange graphs, those show population. The x-axis shows years into the future, out to 2100, and those show they tell us something about the age distribution of the population. So population is on the y-axis over here, and the different shades of orange represent the proportion by age group. And so we see much different, and each of these groups represent a future, a narrative of the future. They are borrowed from the shared socioeconomic pathways of the IPCC. This is work that was done previously for all states in the US and then downscaled to counties. And so this is, and additional work has been done under a related activity to the NPCC process from via the vulnerability impacts assessments, oops, I'm getting the A wrong, vulnerability impacts and adaptation analysis, I think which was also an activity that supported some research needs of NPCC. And so, but this work just what this orange graph tells us, that the future of New York City, it tells us for sure it's going to be older, but how much older depends a lot on some of the other demographic phenomena, and largely it depends on migration. So if we imagine a future where New York receives a lot of migrants, and in the rightmost graphic, we see associated with each of those whether a lot of international migration is allowed, that's the blue line, or whether there's a lot of internal migration. And the green line is just natural growth, which is births minus deaths. The takeaway from this graph is that the assumptions we make and the policies that go in place about migration in particular will really influence the kind of future that New York City will have in demographic terms. It is also true that fertility and mortality, New York has, fertility is declining as it is everywhere, but New York does continue to have some natural growth, but largely the size of the city depends in part on how many migrants it receives, its net migration. And that's what we see in these different graphics. And as a result, the age matters because in particular, older adults are much more vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. Next slide, please. Similarly, this graphic here, and I'll talk about the picture we see and then the words on the graph, but the picture shows us that, and this is a graphic that comes out of the New York City Department of City Planning, demography unit, and it shows us that New York City since 1950 is increasingly diverse in terms of its racial and ethnic composition. So, and that, of course, we're not showing a map of this, but this sort of effort does correspond to different neighborhood characteristics where there is, where we see a wide range of, but we also see a somewhat a segregated city where we have neighborhoods that are dominated by particular ethnic groups, ethnic and racial and ethnic groups across the city. And so we have, and so equity and social justice should be explicitly centered in future climate adaptation goals and implementation efforts and planning, because without centering equity, or we'll put it positively, with centering equity in climate adaptation and mitigation actions, it will help avoid unintended consequences such as green gentrification, which we heard a little bit about from Sheila and Anna, and displacement, and it will provide opportunities to decrease impacts on the most vulnerable. So a map that goes with this tells us a little bit something about where those vulnerability are, but it's unambiguous that diversity is a hallmark of our city and will continue to be in the future. And so, and I present these two examples of understanding the past, because it's the past that helps us understand the future. But the futuring tools that are currently used within the city right now go only, they don't go quite through mid-century. So if we want to have long-term goals, for example, long-term projections of population consistent with, say, climate futures, we need to be thinking about those. We need to have tools that can do that. And Timon will tell us a little bit more about some tools that are available to us, but there are a range of tools that allow us to envision past 2050. And that we would recommend that there's an embrace, that it's time to embrace such tools. Next slide, please. So this particular slide on the top shows us it shows us examples of both government-based on the top above the bar on that graphic, and community-based and non-governmental on the lower half, climate adaptation and resiliency plans based on their spatial and temporal scales. And in addition, the climate hazard that they address. So we see a variety of, there's a lot of engagement on this, but it's mostly focused on the now or the near future rather than the medium term. And there are very few that go out long term. And as we see, they cover a range of, things from extreme heat, stormwater, coastal flooding, fewer on multi-hazards. So we would argue that scenario-based planning, which allows us to take a longer-term perspective, can really help New York City address climate future complexity, because that's one of the reasons that we don't go out to most sectoral approaches won't want to go out to beyond mid-century, and that would allow New York City to address future climate change complexity and uncertainty in particular. Scenario-based planning can incorporate the intrinsic urban dynamics and complexities, and importantly, the uncertainty. Uncertainty is really a challenge for planning, and it's common to the non-anecdotal challenges associated with the, that you find in complex human systems. It's necessary also to address uncertainty over the mid to long range. The tools that we use now are all short and midterm range, and there are good reasons for that, but climate change requires that we think differently. And then this could yield novel opportunities for envisioning and shaping health, social, environmental, economic, and population change outcomes. I think the next slide, please. And I think I'm gonna pass it over to Timon to take over.
Thanks. Can we go back one slide? Thanks, Deborah. Just want to emphasize a couple points here, building on what Deborah just said, and then we'll go to the next slide. One, as Deborah already kind of put in the context, this chapter is really trying to help us think about futures and futures, not only in the immediate future and in the near-term future, which is pretty common in our planning and policy making, but longer-term futures. So that's kind of the larger mandate for this chapter. However, one of the reasons we're looking at this slide is because, again, as Deborah pointed out, a lot of the work that has happened and tends to happen is focused on the near and medium, and yet scenario-based planning that has been embraced by the city and by the region and by the country is really focused on scenarios around future hazard exposure. And Deborah was outlining also how that work has been done to really look at, for example, scenarios of population growth. But I guess the point that we're trying to make here is that scenario-based planning needs to be done for other aspects of our urban system. And that if we can start to bring those together, that would be important. So just to kind of set that up, next slide, please. And that's a little bit what's shown here. This is on the right is an image that's actually taken from the IPCC urban adaptation chapter. And this is making a little bit similar point to what I was making before about the sort of interaction and interdependency of a number of subsystems within the urban system and the way in which they interact. And the key message coming out of our chapter here is that there are interdependencies among lots of parts of our systems, our socioeconomic systems, the ecological, biophysical, and climate system, but also the technological and infrastructural systems of New York City. And that we really have to acknowledge the interdependencies of those systems if we want to avoid unintended consequences and trade-offs that might happen by planning for one part of the system, but not the other at the same time. And we've seen a lot of this. I think this is sort of a case in point around a lot of concerns and even impacts of, quote, greening, where greening isn't being done alongside affordable housing or alongside other kinds of controls that can prevent displacement. And that's really the whole point we're trying to make here too, is that both what we see in the present and especially how we look to the future for a more adapted, but also equitable future, that we need to be doing the scenario-based planning and in a way that looks at the connectedness and the interdependencies of multiple parts of the city. And that's something that I think there's been some early work on, but there's a lot more to do. So if anything, this is a nudge in that direction. And again, that's to help us identify trade-offs that might occur if we can actually look at this very closely and anticipate some of those. And of course, also across scales and time. So when we think about trade-offs, whether it's trade-offs associated with an investment in transportation that might have a potential trade-off and impacts on housing, or an investment in a nature-based solution that then might have an impact on real estate values, these are things that not only recognize the interdependencies, but we need to think about spatially as well, because what happens in one neighborhood can have impacts on a neighborhood, and what happens in the city can have an impact on the region and vice versa. Next slide, please. Another major key message coming out of this chapter is that we want to make sure that decisions that are made in now and in the near term don't become maladaptive in the long term. This is something that was echoed in NPCC and was also echoed very strongly in the previous global IPCC outcomes, is that we are seeing adaptation actions that have unintended consequences that actually show them to be maladaptive. And I'll give a couple sort of brief examples that you can kind of think about. One is well documented in the literature, is how certain ways of investing in coastal adaptation, for example, building a seawall, has been shown in other parts of the world can create false senses of security and actually encourage development. And yet, if such a seawall were built that was not high enough or large enough or strong enough to be able to avoid a worst scenario type of storm surge event, then all of that additional development and that, quote, false sense of security would be called into question when actually it is overwhelmed by some kind of extreme event. And so, that may or not be the best example, but it is a point that we really took seriously in this chapter, that avoiding unintentional maladaptive outcomes, especially if you look farther out, long-term is something that we need to pay more attention to. And, you know, another example might be, as we've been discussing, the ways in which investments in certain types of adaptation solutions, whether it's greening or it's air conditioning to deal with heat or some other kind of investment in adaptation, might have maladaptive consequences for CO2 emissions, or might have maladaptive consequences that cause displacement. So we want to think about this not only about the present decisions that might be maladaptive in the future, but the way a decision that we might take now or in the near term for adaptation might have maladaptation in another sector or in another part of the city. So again, really thinking about both the time and space and the sort of sectoral interdependencies, and this question of how adaptive, when you take a systems perspective, is any particular solution that we might be coming up with, and can we start to wrap our heads around these interdependencies in a way that can help us avoid maladaptations in other sectors, in other spaces, and certainly in the future. So the last part of this point really is that if we do ignore climate risks and equity considerations, as we've been discussing throughout both of these chapters, as well as concerns around siloed planning within a particular sector or with a particular agency or with a particular concern in mind, this are other ways that can lead to maladaptation. So it's not only maladaptation from the present to some future that might be uncertain and changed, but potential for maladaptation because of the siloed nature of a lot of decision making, despite, and we can be quite positive about this, I think, despite a lot of the progress that New York City has made in making decisions across agencies, across sectors, and working hard to work more with communities. But it's hard, it's kind of easy to say, but it's important to say that there's more to be done. And I think that's part of what we're trying to elevate here with this chapter. Next slide, please. When we're talking about short, medium, and long-term planning and the absence of long-term planning, we wanted to highlight some of the work that has been done around setting goals and targets and strategies for achieving equity, justice, sustainability, and resilience. And the report, or rather the chapter, highlights the need for more shared and positive future visions. If we don't know the future that we want to get to, and we don't have some shared visions around that, how are we going to get from the present to the future, and especially in terms of long-term future? And I'll just re-emphasize that when we look at a lot of these climate hazard projections for 2050s and end of century 2100, we have a lot of that information around what we might be exposed to from a climate hazard perspective, but we have very little in terms of looking farther out into the future of what a resilient New York, a really fully adapted New York might look like. But there has been some progress on this, so I'm just going to point this out. One has been some work that's been led out of the Mayor's Office of Climate and Environmental Justice around the Climate Knowledge Exchange. And on the left image here, you can see the State of Climate Knowledge Report that I believe is the second one in a series of reports coming out of the CKE efforts that's really trying to understand what we know and what we don't know as a way of setting a baseline for visioning. Another process that happened in 2021 was a series of 5-week consecutive workshops across city, state, and federal agencies to really try to understand how the government sees its future and looks long-term into the future, and what an adapted New York might look from an agency and cross-agency perspective. And so that's the image on the right, the New York City climate adaptation scenarios for 2100. One of the few efforts to work across sectors and across agencies and across scales to try to understand, and not only the challenges, but to create a space for some shared visioning around what a future adapted New York could actually look like. And I think this is just not an answer to the question, but the beginning of starting to think about how can we develop mechanisms and tools like some of these efforts here that can create a space and a place and an opportunity for diverse stakeholders to come together and really articulate what do we want to see for our children? What do we want to see by the end of this century? And so we can work backwards from there to really set some priorities for the next 5 to 10 years, but with a long-term scenario planning hat on. Let's see if I'm missing anything else on this slide. I think, yes, the last point that's part of this key message out of our chapter is that we do need to do more work on monitoring and evaluation of the progress that we're making and also the progress that we haven't made. And so there's a number of these mechanisms that have been put in place by the city, and yet there's a number of gaps as well in terms of monitoring and evaluation that we would argue need to be advanced for us to not only understand where we want to be, which is something we need to do more work on, but also what we've done and whether or not we're on the pathway to adapted and equitable future that we might articulate as a goal. Next slide, please. A couple other things coming out of our chapter to highlight here in the last couple slides. One is 2 sort of sectoral approaches. The first one here around health, and the next one about sort of working with nature. A few things that happened in our chapter is we took a deep dive in a few different areas. One, really thinking about the ways in which decisions, policies, plans around resilience and equity and sustainability actually require policies, investments that directly support population health, and really thinking about the connections between investments in transportation or in housing, in changes to the right-of-way, in shifts in how we think about energy, how all of those need to be thought of in a way that they can have positive impacts on health. There's also a health focus in other chapter within NPCC, but this came into our chapter as we started to think about the future really intentionally, and it seemed pretty obvious that, and a key message clearly coming out of the chapter is that we want to be thinking across multiple types of adaptation investments and resilience investments, and to be having a health question fundamental threaded through all of that. So some examples for we were prioritizing, and some of this is already happening around active modes of transportation, including transit, walking, cycling, et cetera. How can we be making those investments with health outcomes, positive health outcomes, as very intentional drivers of those types of adaptation investments? Similarly, the ways in which we might be thinking about sustainability in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, and the portion of that that's coming from private vehicles, not only other types of trucking or the building or the sector that might be part of those, that is part of those emissions, but how can we also start to prioritize some of those sustainability goals in ways that have positive health outcomes? Another, and this leads a little bit into the next slide, is thinking about the ways in which we can continue to change the car-centric development of the history of New York City into one that makes space for continually to improve on the walkability of the city in ways that make streets and sidewalks more inviting for walking, safer for walking, and not just walking, but other modes that have positive both physical and mental health outcomes. And, again, threaded through this is thinking about it from an equity lens so that those outcomes are ones that we would see across a diverse range of New Yorkers. Next slide, please. Another key piece that came out of the futures chapter, even though it has a bit of a short space in terms of the actual amount of text in the chapter, but we spent a lot of time talking and thinking about it, is the role of nature as a sort of underpinning adaptation efforts within the city. And hopefully this isn't surprising to folks, but the literature is quite clear that investments in nature have many co-benefits. And so an investment that might provide cooling to a neighborhood or to a building also has a number of co-benefits, providing habitat for biodiversity, being a source of public and also mental health and other societal benefits. So the co-benefits piece here is really one of the most important reasons for investing in nature as both a short, medium, and a long-term goal for adapting the city to the kinds of climate challenges that we're facing. And that's because it not only provides climate benefits, but can provide other social benefits. But we also recognize that has to be done, as we mentioned before, in connection with other types of decisions and investments that have to be essentially done simultaneously. I think this is not this is easy to say and not that easy to do, which is to say, how can we couple investments that might be in green infrastructure together with investments in affordable housing and housing security and other ways of avoiding displacement or investing in neighborhood in a more holistic way. But we do call out the need to think about how we can plan and implement and manage investments in nature as a way of achieving more holistic resilience that connects both investments in the built infrastructure, investments in our social infrastructure, but also in our natural infrastructure. Next slide, please. This is the last slide, I believe, and Deborah, I'll invite you to come back in if you want to add anything here. There's a number of gaps that we point out and needs for future research, some of which we've sort of been discussing all along in this chapter and in the presentation of this chapter, including the need to think beyond the short and medium term and thinking more longer term, using scenario planning tools that can assess a whole range of alternative visions. We don't all have to have the same vision. There's not only one future for New York, but what is the range of future visions and scenarios that we can then not only have, but start to compare and contrast and really try to look at them and choose amongst them for decisions that we might be able to make now and in the present. We do need to build some tools to be able to do this, to be able to achieve better decision making now that can have long-term impacts, that can avoid some of the potentials for maladaptation or potential for unintended consequences that come from very positively intended investments we might be making in the present. And just to highlight, I think hopefully this has already been well said, but sort of cross-sectoral nature of adaptation and resilience planning, both whether that's short-term or long-term, that really needs to be centered here. For example, the way thinking about housing futures needs to be done alongside thinking about investments in nature for futures, and again, the intersections of the built and social and natural environment that we want to be able to consider together when we think about the future of New York in a way that achieves an adapted New York in the long term. And this again is because the goal is to try to create some of these scenario planning approaches and to really lean on them as a way of doing some analysis, bringing people together and understanding where the trade-offs are so that they can be minimized as much as possible. We aren't pretending that we're going to, that these tools automatically are going to tell us where all the trade-offs, and because we know them, we're going to be able to avoid them all, but a stronger effort to be able to minimize trade-offs and unintended consequences, I think, is key, and the chapter came together to really sort of highlight this, I believe, across everyone. So there are tools out there. We sort of mentioned this as what's in italics, that there's a number of frameworks that have been used by other bodies at the global scale, for example, but really bringing these into city-specific context is relatively new. So we're pushing the boundary here, but that's exactly our goal with this chapter, is to say we have to do some things when we think about the future of New York that maybe we've started on, but we haven't done enough. And that's not because it's easy, and it's not because it's happening everywhere else, but we want to push the boundaries if we're really going to be able to achieve the goals that I think most of us share around future of New York that's resilient, also sustainable, but also equitable and more just. So I'll, I guess, leave it there. And Deborah, maybe I missed a couple things you want to add before we close?
Great, thanks, Timon. I just want to pick up where you're leaving off, which is, New York is a leader in terms of climate change planning. And so the fact that we have this challenge to think about futuring in new ways, New York is in some ways the perfect place to think about it. It's a global leader of cities, and it's also a leader in thinking about urban action around climate change. But it doesn't mean that it'll be easy to do. And I'd like to point out that if we wait until 2050 to start thinking about 2100 or 2060 or 2070, it'll be too late. So we intentionally, the working group was called Futures and Transitions because we wanted to think about both the futuring exercises and the transition space. We found it easier to be clear that it was easier to think about transitions where some transitions are already underway, for example, in some energy systems. And in fact, with energy in mind, energy was some work related to energy was being done in our working group and in the health working group. And in the end, we ended up having a separate chapter on energy and energy insecurity. And I believe that'll be covered in a future CC Run seminar along with the health working group. But and that'll be in the next series. But the point is that we have the flexibility to think about these things. And it's important to recognize that if we're like in areas that we're discussing featuring exercise still, it's partly because transition activities have yet to be, we're further from evaluating how well we would be doing in transitioning concerns, for example. So those are, so it's a new area it really is a new area of science and a new area of engagement. And so, we welcome your questions. We welcome engagement more broadly from anybody who's interested in this area. And I'll stop there. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks to both of you, Deborah and Timon, for that presentation. I'll invite again everyone who has specific questions for Deborah and Timon to put them in the Q&A. And after we have sort of specific discussion about this presentation, then we can open it up to general conversation. And I guess I'll just kick it off with a question to you, Timon, since you were just talking about tools and you mentioned that IPCC and others have already developed tools. But I mean, tying this together with the first presentation, and specifically the mention of the importance of engaging, giving communities a sort of role in the decision-making around adaptation. Do you have examples of tools that are widely accessible? I mean, I'm talking about tools that can really be used in on-the-ground grassroots planning activities, not just, for high-level government agencies that have fancy computers and software. I'm talking about sort of tools that really do facilitate conversation amongst community members about what their future should look like.
Yeah, thanks, Franco. That's great. It's probably should have been more explicit about this, but when we're talking about tools, we're generally talking about planning tools, and we're not really thinking so much about technological tools, but rather frameworks and approaches that can be used in workshop settings or other moments that are really focused on engagement, but tools that are explicitly designed to elicit both long-term visioning as well as sort of comparing and contrasting across sectors and trying to really uncover interdependencies. That's where there's both sort of frameworks that can sort of help set the stage for this, but I don't think there's any sort of simple way to solve that. New York is a very complex place. It's a very large place. There's a lot of constituents and a lot of different stakeholders. And so the work of creating space and time for people to be able to share their thoughts and ideas and innovations and knowledge around the future they want for their neighborhood or their street or their home or their city is one that takes time. And I think this is one of the big challenges we have, is that we have a need for sort of urgent responses, and yet we need to take the time to listen and hear and really uncover the diverse knowledges that are out there and bring those into conversation. So coming back to tools, there are tools within the scenario planning toolkit, exercises and approaches and frameworks that can be brought into some of these settings, I think, that can really help to not only elicit knowledge, which does happen, but to allow us to be able to look at these questions about trade-offs or unintended consequences, or how we can think about across scale, across sectors, and over multiple points of time. And that's something where there's definitely more work to do. And that's, at least from my mind, what we're suggesting around tools. But I'll see if Deborah has some other thoughts around that as well. It's not to say that there aren't other things that we can do, like Deborah's incredible work around not just population projections, but thinking about the social demography and how that might change, and how that's an important fundamental baseline for us to think about the future of any particular neighborhood or the future of the city. And there are other things like that that might be require more sophisticated analysis or ways we can make that kind of information available to communities. But I also think a lot of this is taking the time, and it requires resources and commitment to hear from communities and enable those conversations in a way that they can be brought into the decision-making process, whether that's within a borough or within the city, or other mechanism.
Yeah, that makes sense. I was just, when you gave those two very illustrative examples of maladaptation, I was thinking that there was something generalizable about that, right? There's, there are many communities that are thinking about a levee or a seawall, and there are many communities that are thinking about giving out air conditioners, and the sort of linkage between those interventions to potential unintended consequences are not, they might just need a reminder. There might be a tool that, to me, that would be a really useful tool, which would, inform a discussion in some community at some point in time about doing something, and just like, hey, by the way, here are all the, here's the sort of diagram that links this intervention to other things. That's kind of what I was thinking when it's
Yeah, I hear you. Yeah, I agree.
So another question, as we're waiting for folks to put things in the Q&A, I had for you, Deborah. I mean, what I was struck by with those different graphics, the orange graphics, is that how the demographic uncertainty, perhaps at this point, is greater than the climate uncertainty in terms of planning, or maybe not. I was just wondering, like, as we think about scenario planning, which involves looking at the variability in conditions that we might encounter in the future. I mean, is obviously they're not independent variables, right? To some extent, climate is related to the demographics, but I don't know, just how do you think about the sort of demographic uncertainty compared to the climate uncertainty?
That's a great question. Normally we don't really have to answer it. I mean, but I think going through the same exercise that we do with the climate, when we think about climate futures, right, and we evaluate the how and even in the entire assessment, when we think about traceable accounts, right? So this is the nitty-gritty. For those of you who don't know how assessments usually proceed, we write a chapter, we develop key messages, and then we identify traceable accounts, which identify the evidence basis for our findings. And these traceable accounts, allow us to talk in language of the probability of events being likely and the certainty we have associated with those probabilities. So that's why we can have a low probability but a very high impact climate condition that we care a lot about, right? Like a sea level rise under a high, for example, and so with certain, like in the 95th percentile of the sea level rise projections, for example, they meet. So we have, and within the demographic, there are certain things about the demography that are really certain, and that's aging. Like New York City is going to get older. No matter which feature we have, it's going to be getting older. How much older it gets depends upon largely what the aging is a consequence. It's a good thing. It's a consequence of greater life expectancy and lower mortality, but it's also a consequence of lower birth rates. Now it won't, right now we do have variation in fertility across the city, but New York City on average has, like the rest of the country, has below replacement fertility. We don't have, and so cities grow because we have migrants over time. So natural increase matters, but migration matters too. And migration does not follow the same patterns historically. It doesn't follow the momentum that we find in the processes of fertility and mortality. And so it's really uncertain. It is, and to pretend it's not uncertain is, it is doing a huge disservice. So, and it's, and to make matters worse, within the general community of like this idea of climate migration, or that people will all move upstate because upstate is much more desirable. There's no evidence of that either, really. So, I mean, there's very little evidence of that. So, that is not to say that policies couldn't be put in place that would encourage migration. It becomes easier to get around a city that has really good transit, for example. And so those are the kinds of things we can build into a future and then evaluate those possibilities. And then talk about the uncertainty associated with them. So fertility is by and large falling. We know that with high certainty. Migration could go both from international sources and from domestic sources, huge unknown. And then when we look in the past 100 years, we see a lot of precedent for different migration regimes. So and over time, most New York neighborhoods have grown actually from natural increase, but we don't expect that to be the case in the 21st century, certainly the second half of
Have you
it. Franco,
noticed that-
while I'm answering,
Yeah, go ahead.
wait, go ahead. No, go ahead.
I was just going to say, but you mentioned climate migration, and I was wondering if there's any evidence that climate disasters in different parts of the world translate to a blip in the New York City. In other words, is New York City a place where people, Central America, other places where you see hurricanes, and that do we see influxes in the population due to climate disasters, and is that type of uncertainty, how does that affect the future population?
It's really hard to say that like I cannot give you a direct answer to that. It is true that partly because places that send migrants are also places that have, in addition to maybe climate pressures or disaster or extreme events or disasters, may also have civil unrest as well. So and sometimes distinguish the two are conflated in the real lives of individuals, like people who lose livelihoods due to drought, for example, or people who which we do see for example, in some Central American countries, but then it's compounded by other forms of civil unrest and loss of liberties in those countries as well. So those, I think it's, so we don't, I can't answer that question for you, but I think it's worth trying to pay attention to. And also, but I mean, it's fair to say that it's migration issues are, international migration is important to the growth of New York City. We tend to absorb international migrants, and then in New York City is an expensive place to live, and lots of migrants, after being here for a short period of time, move out. So we on net lose people through migration, partly because we don't offer sustainable livelihoods within New York City, perhaps through housing and so on, or it's just the first place that people can be received. And so, but this question, I think, will become more important, whether we will receive immigrants from countries that are under climate stress. We are historically, we're a welcoming, we're a hub of international migration, right? I also wanted to point out that someone, Rupu Gupta, asked a question, and I gave half an answer. I hit return before the second half. And the second half of the question was related: how would concerns about immediate needs and risks be balanced with longer term conditions that are harder to imagine for economically vulnerable groups? Thanks for your thought on this. I know these are complex considerations, and I would say maybe Timon has some comments on this too, which is that, and I think some of our NPCC colleagues are also online, that they want to add to the question and answer thoughts on this. But if we allow ourselves or force ourselves the exercise of thinking about 2100, we start thinking about what those trade-offs are. If we're thinking about the decisions that we need to make now, and the only thing we can think about is now, or 10 years from now, or 20 years from now, it's, okay, maybe it's a lot easier to think about now because 20 years will be here soon. I mean, I think there's a very strong, but when you start requiring further out, and we look at models where we look further out, and there are such models in building code. There are such models in, I learned the other day from Joel Towers, in various kinds of models in some kinds of fire code that are used, that we have to ask ourselves about trade-offs. And in the chapter, we do look at tools that are available for evaluating these trade-offs. But I think this is, again, an area where we have to do more. And in order to understand how hard decisions about addressing current needs and future needs can be made in the same, but in the same framing. Of course, we will ignore future needs, though, if we never ask about them. And so at least one thing we do in this chapter is make sure that we pay attention to those as well. Timon?
Yeah, I just want to add to that, and also because I think messed up a Q&A question by clearing it when I was trying to answer it. And so I'm sorry, I forgot who posted it, but it was, essentially, is there pushback on thinking long term?
I was just going to ask that one from Lisa. Yes.
Okay, thank you, from Lisa. So thanks for that, Lisa, because I think it relates a lot to what Deborah was just saying, and there is for good reason, right? First, on the positive side, in just that one example, and not to overuse it, but in this one of the few times where, at least with agency folks, have been able to come together and think long term, what we heard was that never happens. That's never happened in their career, or and how good it was to be able to get out of what they do in their daily job, which is working on planning for the near term, generally, unless you're working on a 2030 plan, just 6 years away, or maybe a 2050 plan, but that never happens, and that it's sort of liberating in a way to be able to have some time and get permission to spend that time thinking about what we could achieve if we gave ourselves more time. So there's a sort of liberation in being able to look at the end of the century, because you can ignore the politics or the lack of finance or other issues that, anything that you pay attention to now or in the next 5 years and even next 10 years are really problematic. And yet we need to do that if we're going to set the visions, and we need to do that if we're going to be able to think seriously about the kinds of climate challenges that we may be facing by the end of the century. And back to Deborah's point, it enables thinking about a number of other kinds of trade-offs when you do that. However, there's pushback, and we've seen this in similar types of work, both within city, state, or federal agencies, as well as at the community level, in the present is already difficult, and the present already requires a lot of immediate response and work, and so it's difficult to think about longer term futures. And so I think it's quite, in some ways, maybe very obvious why so much of planning and policy is focused on the present, not only because of administration cycles and political cycles that tend to keep us focused on goals that can be achieved in a very short period of time, whether or not they have maladaptive consequences or unintended consequences in the long term, but also even that the planning horizons tend to be quite short. It's also because when you talk to communities, we hear very rightly so that they have problems that need to be addressed today. And so whatever problems could emerge in the longer term future are not as pressing as the problems of today, or the problems that have been faced in the recent past, or the ones they're concerned about in the next couple of years. So there too, I think at every scale, it's very difficult actually to do long-term planning. And yet when it comes to climate change, as Deborah already said, if we're not starting to do that now in a very intentional way and taking advantage of the tools that we do have and creating new tools that we might need to start to look and make plans, set targets and goals and strategies that need to be underway now in order to get on a pathway that delivers a better future, then I think we're in trouble. And so that's just something that is, every city around the world is behind on, and New York City has a chance, I think, to get out in front on this too.
Thanks. And I'd like to sort of welcome Sheila and Anna to join the conversation again, just to sort of open it up to all the authors who presented today, and to invite everyone else, if you have any questions, sort of collective questions or questions to direct back to Anna and Sheila, to please do so. And while we're waiting for those, I might just, sort of like, I wonder if there's anyone who wants to say something about nature equity in the future, right? I mean, nature-based solutions have come up in a variety of places of today's discussion, right? In one case, sort of nature-based solutions, if implemented incorrectly, leading to displacement, leading to gentrification, but I think, in the second presentation, nature-based solutions, or nature becoming sort of something, a desirable future element of the city, more nature. So what's that, obviously, how do we think about this? Like, how do we achieve a future that includes a more healthy relationship with nature that does not lead to disproportionate, sort of advantages going to certain populations. Since this seminar series is about green infrastructure, climate, and cities, I just thought it would be appropriate to ask you all to sort of think about that. Didn't mean to ask a bombshell question, but I
think probably everyone has something to say. So I don't know who wants to start.
Go for
Okay, I'll start it this way. Investments in infrastructure can cause displacement. Investments in nature can cause displacement. Investments in almost any part of the city not only can, but have. So, gentrification can be driven by many things, and generally it's a combination of things. Zoning being one of them historically that's been a massive driver. So I think there's sort of two issues at play. One is that nature has a lot of potential benefits for climate adaptation, and yet nature can be a tool that can be negative in terms of its impacts, especially on low income and other populations. And that's true for lots of other parts of the system as well. So I'm in favor of two things. One is we shouldn't demonize nature. It's not green infrastructure or nature that's the problem. It's how are we using particular types of infrastructure or investments, whether they're hard or soft, or even social strategies or policies, and how can we ensure that those are ones that are being looked at from an equity lens from the beginning and all the way through? How can we be sure that those are ones where there's diverse voices at the table, where whatever community is going to be affected is part of the decision-making process? And then, as we were saying, I think the hard part is that whether it's an investment in a nature-based solution or something else, it's kind of hard not to have unintended consequences with anything that causes sort of a quote positive economic outcome, right? Something that might drive up housing prices or others, and it's nature can do that, and so can a seawall, and so can some other kind of investment in other amenities in a community. How do we avoid that? I think one of the ways, and I'm sure others have even better ideas than I do, is to couple together a range of investments and policies and decisions that are intentional about avoiding displacement and that are intentional about centering community voices in the decision-making process. So that's why I mentioned something like, if you're going to invest in trees or greening a neighborhood, but we know that this can increase real estate values and that can lead to displacement, then why can't we also couple financial incentives or rent controls or other types of ways that are very intentional about making sure that if there's impacts on real estate values, that those are offset by subsidizing those actual costs for the people who live there, who not only shouldn't be moved out, but should be part of figuring out what exactly it is that they need in order to be able to stay. In some cases, it may be that nature isn't the solution in those locations. So I just think it's a tough problem, and that zeroing in on one aspect and calling it out isn't really the solution. It's actually about trying to think across a whole range of parts of any neighborhood that need to be improved to be adaptive, and yet have to be thought about from this lens of how do we avoid these maladaptive consequences for particular people who are generally more at risk already.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, I don't think it's a question of nature. I think it's a question of development and policy. And to that extent, I think we should think about gentrification and displacement as separate but overlapping phenomena. We want to avoid widespread displacement, which is disruptive socially and economically, in particular for groups that live in historically disinvested areas. They're losing a lot of assets, include, social and economic. I think that's very different than gentrification, which is a kind of improvement of a neighborhood through nature, through new shops, through new infrastructure, hard infrastructure and soft infrastructure. A lot of frontline communities would say they're not against gentrification. They want the good stuff too, including trees and nature. But they want governments and investment communities to work with them a little closer on policies that will protect them. So Timon has already mentioned some of those, but we know the things that work, right? Rent and development controls, right to stay or return policies, increase public and social housing, inclusionary zoning, land banks and land trusts, et cetera. Luxury, taxes. So I think that's partly what we tried to get to, is to kind of unpack some of the ways in which we use gentrification and displacement interchangeably, which I think wraps in a lot of stuff it just makes the real issue opaque. And the real issue is really, I think, land values and development and the displacing effect of an extractive economy without enough protections for vulnerable folks.
That's very interesting. If I put those two things together, it's like, sort of coupling investments in nature with other investments in housing and infrastructure and other things, that public goods that make neighborhoods better, and doing that in a way with policies in place that prevent displacement, but encourage neighborhood improvement, because people really
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And we do know what works, right? From a policy perspective, we don't have to invent any of these things, right?
Right. So there's a question from an anonymous attendee about the insurance industry and the municipal bond industry, and their sort of receptivity to a long-term perspective on planning. I don't know if anyone wants to address that. No.
From what I know, the answer is that is true. I'm not sure what else to say about it. I think that is actually true, that the bond market and the insurance industry absolutely are, forcing a more long-term perspective. I'm not sure that I know much more about that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, including in some places, the insurance industry deciding to leave particular markets. I mean, as we see, like reinsurance in Florida, the decline there, for example. But we've seen some things in parts of New York City, I think, as well. So, on a much more limited scale.
All right.
Or we see the equivalent, like we see, buybacks in like parts of Staten Island post Superstorm Sandy and so forth, for example, and Brooklyn.
Well, but I've also heard recently about a new form of insurance, of parametric insurance, which is sort of things you can do right now that will reduce the chance of a particular hazard having a particular impact, which to me is interesting, because that's sort of like ultra short term, right? It's like, is there something that an insured entity can do tomorrow that will protect it against the hazard that's happening tomorrow, so that there's not a payout required? So I don't know, that's sort of in contrast to the long-term perspective. All right. Well, if there are no more questions, I think we will sort of close. We have one more of these NPCC CC run sort of collaborations coming at the March 6th, which is the first Wednesday of March. And FYI, this series is always the first Wednesday of the month, and this one will be focusing on health and energy implications of climate change in New York City. But with that, I'd like to just thank our four speakers today for a really vigorous discussion and covering a lot of ground, and welcome you all to join us next month for the next in this series. So thanks, everybody, and have a good evening.